I'm at the FCC in Hong Kong, and welcome to our guests. You're spread across time zones across the world. So good morning and good evening to both of you. So I'm joined here from Tasmania in Australia by Dean Yates. Hi, Dean.
Hi, Olivia.
Dean is, just to give you a little introduction, is a journalist who's worked as a writer and editor for Reuters for 26 years across Asia and the Middle East. And when he left his last role at Reuters, he was head of journalist mental health and wellbeing. And his memoir is about to be out on June 27th, I think it is, which is very relevant to this discussion. It's all about the experiences that he's gone through with trauma. Just to point out, if you see a journalist hovering over Dean's shoulder, she's filming for him for ABC Australia this week for a program that's sort of related to his book. So making people aware on camera that that's who she is. Thank you so much for joining us. And also joining from Canada is Professor Anthony Feinstein, who is one of the world's leading experts on the subject of the emotional well-being of journalists, among other topics. And he's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and he's written, I think, by my count, 6 books on the subject of mental health of journalists, including his latest book, Moral Courage, which is due out in October. Hope I'm right on that. And he's also provided therapy for countless journalists. So I feel that we're in the best hands we possibly could be on this subject with the two of you. So Anthony, I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about your research. So it was in the early 2000s that you did what was the first research paper on the topic of mental health in journalism, was it? And
That's right, yeah.
Found in that study.
So first off, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to join you. You're right. So we did a study back in 1999, running into 2000, looking at journalists who covered war zones. What was their psychological well-being like? To my great surprise at the time, there hadn't been a single publication of the topic, which is very unusual because there's a huge trauma literature out there, looking at veterans, police people, victims of assault, rape, etc. But there wasn't a single publication devoted to journalists who devote their careers to covering war. And so that study was funded by the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., and we compared a group of journalists who defined themselves by war reporting and compared them to a group of domestic journalists who'd never done foreign corresponding work. And we did a very exhaustive inquiry of their mental state, their psychological well-being. No surprise, we found that the journalists who go to war had more post-traumatic stress disorders, more depression. But for me, the most interesting finding was that despite having more emotional difficulties, they were not more likely to get therapy. So there was this group of journalists who were clearly suffering with emotional challenges, but they weren't getting the therapy for it. To put it in a broad context, we estimated that journalists who've been covering war for about 15 years on average had a lifetime prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder that was equivalent to veterans of combat. So, that's quite a high rate. The study could have died there, but there were 1 or 2 people in the media who found it very interesting. The paper made it into the New York Times, and Chris Kramer at CNN, at the time he ran CNN International, contacted me and said, "This is really interesting work. Can you come tell us a bit more about it?" And I said, "Sure." And soon after we published that paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry, 9/11 took place, and then there was the war in Iraq. And, Chris called me and said, "We've got this large group of journalists in Kuwait waiting to go into Iraq. Some of them are going to be attached to military units. Is this good or bad for them from a mental health perspective?" And I said, "I don't know, but I'm a researcher and we can try and answer the question." And so with a grant from CNN and ITN in the United Kingdom, we did a study to see whether embedded journalism was good for the psychological well-being of journalists. And we found that it didn't make a difference. And the reason it didn't make a difference was it didn't matter whether you were with the cavalry or not, your exposure to violence and trauma was very similar. And once again, we show that this was a very, very dangerous profession. In the first 3 months of the war in Iraq, 16 foreign correspondents were killed. So never mind the Iraqi journalists, of course, who paid a far higher price for covering this war. And so that was a continuation of some of our earlier work. And then after that, suddenly you find yourself becoming the authority because it's a very small research field. UNESCO came calling and said, we're worried about journalists in Mexico. There's a very high rate of, drug-related violence, and how are journalists managing this? And so UNESCO funded a study on Mexican journalists. And we showed very, very high rates of trauma in this group, because what the cartels had learned to do was that if you wanted to silence a journalist, you didn't just target the journalist, but you targeted their families, their children, their wives, their grandparents. And so you had this familial trauma. And for some journalists, that was just going too far. And they would self-censor, they would stop working on a story. And we found that 25% of our Mexican sample were too traumatized or too scared to go on with their stories. And then, of course, that raises questions. What does it mean about a democratic country when your media is being cowed into silence like this? And so, bit by bit over the years, my team has moved away from looking at Western journalists, looking at journalists in other parts of the world. Yeah. We did a study in Kenya, and I can go on and on and on, so you can stop me. But there are a couple, highlights that I want to just draw your attention to. We did a study looking at user-generated content. What's it like if your job as a journalist is to sit in a newsroom, a darkened room all day, screening out often horrendous visual images from war zones or famine zones, etc. And that's a really important question, because the American Psychiatric Association has recently tweaked the criteria for PTSD, bringing in a criterion that says, if in your line of work you are exposed to visually troubling images, that is now considered a sufficient stressor to trigger PTSD. And we showed that. So for some journalists who are doing this work all day long, 7, 8, 9 hours a day, just looking at these images, that can be very traumatic. Now, the rates of distress in that group are not as high as journalists who go to war zones, because there's no direct threat to the person. It's vicarious trauma, looking at the trauma of others. But for some people, that can be very difficult.
Yeah.
And then the most recent work we did was on the question of moral injury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important to point out, that we're not just talking about journalists who have gone to war zones. The work of journalism can bring you into contact with these very traumatizing events as well, even if you're sitting behind your computer and feeling safe. But just one quick question. When you were starting to do this research, how did news organizations react at the time, when you were in the early 2000s bringing them these results?
Well, it was interesting when our research project launched in 2000. It coincided with the death of two very celebrated journalists, Kurt Schork at Reuters and Miguel Galmereno, who was a cameraman at Associated Press. And both were highly respected, very experienced journalists. And their deaths in Sierra Leone sent a shockwave through the profession. And so at the same time, we were talking about trauma that comes with, very bad events. And so the organizations were quite receptive to it. I think they were reeling from the deaths of these two journalists. And suddenly here was a researcher saying, well, hold on a second, this is really dangerous work. With danger comes psychological trauma. Let's try to work out what's going on. And so to begin with, they were curious. In our very first study, we had a sample of 170 journalists from big news organizations. 140 took part. This was a rate of over 80% of journalists wanting to take part, which is very, very unusual in the social sciences. You don't usually get an 80% response rate to this kind of work. And so I think it was triggered by a confluence of factors. The death of two well-known journalists, suddenly news organizations becoming really interested in it, and then almost like an aha moment, which was, why had we never thought of this? Why are we neglecting it? And so there was a lot of interest to begin with. It became quite harder to sustain that, but to begin with, there was a lot of interest.
Yeah, okay. And Dean, can you speak a little bit about your career? While Anthony was engaged in this research, you were living that kind of war reporter's life, working as an editor and correspondent for Reuters in pretty dangerous situations and places. Were you aware, what was your understanding about mental health at that time? Was it on your radar, and was there a culture of silence around the impact of covering difficult events?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Look, I had no understanding of mental health issues when I was working in Iraq, when I was covering events like the Bali bombings, the Boxing Day tsunami. In fact, when I was asked to apply for the Reuters Baghdad bureau chief's job while I was based in Jerusalem, and this was the end of 2006, and my wife and I went through all the various issues that I might face as a bureau chief, you know, the safety of my staff, the intensity of the story. Not once did we actually stop and think, what about the potential impact on me mentally? We didn't even talk. I didn't even think we knew PTSD existed, to be honest. And I think that was pretty much I think that was pretty widespread amongst journalists at that time. I don't recall a single conversation with anyone about PTSD all those years I spent in Iraq. And so, you know, Anthony was doing this work, this groundbreaking work, but it wasn't filtering down to a lot of people in the field like myself. We were very aware of physical safety. Obviously, that was an enormous issue. And there was a lot of cooperation among media organizations around physical safety. You know, we fought hard on the story, but the physical safety of our staff came first. And there was wonderful cooperation there. But it just sort of, I'm not quite sure when the needle really moved as far as I was concerned. Well, I know when it did. It was when I was finally diagnosed with PTSD in 2016. But it took that long before I really understood how these events that I had covered, the deaths of, you know, two of my staff were killed in Iraq in that infamous attack known as collateral murder. It took a decade. It was a decade later before the impact of that all filtered through and all the symptoms and everything. Finally, my wife insisted that I go and see a psychiatrist, and I got that diagnosis.
Yeah, it's so interesting that it wasn't even spoken about then, but because could you talk a little bit about some of the places you did report from? So it was the Bali bombings in 2002 and the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004. And then this attack that killed your colleagues in 2007. Did you feel that those events were different to report on in terms of how it was affecting you at the time?
No, so I worked for Reuters, right? News agency. I just got up and did another story. It was just like you just kept going. There was always, it was so busy. And I mean, it's always, journalists are always busy, right? But there was something about that decade, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, the terrorism, natural disasters. And for me, it was like, you just kept going, you just kept pushing on. And in a sense, you were too busy to process what you'd been through. But I think we just blocked it out as well. We drank heavily. That was how we dealt with these things. I suspected that the deaths of my staff would come back to haunt me, because it was such a hideous incident. And I felt responsible as the bureau chief in Iraq. I felt responsible I was responsible for their safety. And I think this was something that a lot of journalists felt in Iraq, because so many journalists were killed and wounded and mentally scarred, that I think a lot of journalists have come out of Iraq with this feeling of responsibility and did they let people down? And that's certainly how I felt. And that's what caught up with me many years later.
And when you first started to experience PTSD, what did you notice? How did it show up?
Yeah, it was the classic PTSD symptoms, noise sensitivity, emotional numbness, anger, flashbacks, that sort of thing. But the thing that really, and was actually the last thing to emerge before I was admitted to a psych ward, was guilt and shame over the deaths of my staff. And I just had this sense, this incredible sense of guilt and shame over what had happened to these two men, these Iraqi men. And I just didn't understand it. I wasn't quite sure where it was coming from and what it all meant. And it was only before my first admission to a psych ward in 2016, that a colleague of mine said, you know, you might want to have a look at this term moral injury that some people are talking about. And it was then when I read about moral injury for the first time, and I thought, wow, that describes exactly how I feel, because I failed to protect my staff. There was something I failed to do.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a pin in that moral injury. We're coming on to that. I really want to talk more about that. But Can you tell us, just for anyone who's never heard a description of what it's like to be admitted to a psych ward? So you're in Ward 17 in Melbourne Hospital in Melbourne, which is for veterans, first responders, particularly people with trauma. And what happens when you get admitted there, and how long were you there for?
Yes, I've had 3 admissions there, and it was a scary experience. It was frightening, actually, because I knew walking through the glass door of Ward 17 that there was no going back. You can't take away a psych ward admission, right? You've got that forever, and this is the stigma, right? This is the stigma when it was the very best thing for me. I mean, I was suicidal before my admission. That was why I went there. But it was a very frightening experience because I knew that I really needed to make some progress in there. But what actually frightened me more, as much as anything, was going in there and meeting these veterans, meeting these coppers and these paramedics, who I thought, when I compared myself to them, I thought, these people have really seen trauma. They have really experienced a front line, whereas I spent most of my time in Iraq behind blast walls, protected behind blast walls. And so initially I was sort of comparing myself to them and thinking I was sort of somehow less worthy of this world-class treatment. But once I got over that and embraced the treatment and the care that I got, it was a life-saving experience.
And how long were you in there the first time?
5 weeks.
Okay. And Anthony, can you talk about that idea that when people compare suffering, is that something that holds a lot of people back from getting help? People think, I don't deserve this. There's people much worse off than me, particularly journalists.
They do, absolutely. That's been a real barrier to journalists reaching out for help. Journalists come back from a war zone, they see terrible things. They see, people who've lost everything, lost family members, lost their home, lost their professions, lost their livelihood. And they come back and say, what right do I have to complain when the people I've reported on have it so much worse? And of course, there is no equivalency in terms of, the magnitude of the trauma. But, my response to that is a very simple one, which is, there's a false dichotomy here, because let's look at physical illness. If you break a leg and you go into hospital and the person in the bed next to you has broken 2 legs, you don't kind of hobble out of bed and go home and say, hey, that person, you wouldn't think of that. You wait around for your leg to be fixed. So why should it be different for psychological trauma? And it's different because of what Dean spoke about, of stigma and a sense that there's something different about this. But that's a false dichotomy. There's no difference between physical and mental illness. It's all the same. It's all illness. It's all people who are unwell. And, failure to provide therapy for psychological difficulties results in individuals coming down very hard, tremendous suffering. And so you've got to break through this barrier. When journalists say to me, I don't deserve to get therapy because other people have it so much worse, that's a cognitive trap. It's a cognitive distortion. And there are many distortions that can stop people getting therapy, but that's one of them. And you really have to address that, because otherwise, it just doesn't start.
And do you think it's made worse just by some of the stereotypes in journalism that, you need to be tough to work in the industry, and if you can't handle seeing, even if it's difficult images, then you're not going to get ahead if you're not tough enough to be sent to
Well, it was, I think, it's the old Tom Wolfe thing. You've got to have the right stuff. Well, what's the right stuff? But you've got to suck it up. But I mean, once again, that's another cognitive trap. There are many very, very tough, brave people who develop PTSD. I mean, these are just cognitive traps that you fall into, making these mistakes in terms of your thinking. And then those become the barriers that prevent you from getting the kind of help that you need. And there's a wonderful title for a Martha Gellhorn biography, and she's a very great war reporter who developed PTSD, by the way, but she kept it quiet because, in her era, you didn't speak about these things. And the title of the biography was Nothing Ever Happens to the Brave. And it's a great title for a book, but it's absolutely wrong. Very bad things happen to brave people, and very brave people can develop PTSD. Those are 2 fundamentally different things.
Yeah, I like that idea of the cognitive trap. It's interesting. And so moral injury, so this term that you said was helpful to you, Dean, to learn. And I know you now have it tattooed on one of your shoulders.
And my back.
Right. Why did it help when you learned about it? Because what was the definition of it then? I've seen it described as damage done to the soul. How can we explain what moral injury is, and how's it different from PTSD?
Well, I think I'm going to let Anthony give the explanation for moral injury, because he's going to do a better job than I am. But for me, what it was I read that moral injury could occur when someone either did something or failed to prevent something from happening, or bore witness to something that deeply transgressed your moral or ethical values. And for me, it was like, that's it. I failed to protect my staff. That just nailed it for me. That was why I felt this guilt and this shame. Now, that was just the start of what was a number of elements to the moral injury that I felt over that event. There were other elements to it as well, because when Julian Assange published the tape that showed their deaths in 2010, I didn't say anything. I was shocked by the tape. I felt numb, and so I just didn't say anything for years, even though I was the one who knew more about what happened on that day than anyone. And so I didn't tell the story of what really happened, and that really got to me later. And I worked out more about this while I was in Ward 17, and it was my failure to speak up that I really felt terrible about. So I found that there was a number of elements to moral injury in my own experience. But I'm going to let Anthony explain what it is, because I think he'll give a better definition than me.
Well, I think you did it really well, Dean. I mean, I think it's a condition that arises from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. And I think it comes about from acts of commission, things that you do, and acts of omission, the things that you didn't do, that you failed to do. And you've touched on the core emotional features of it, which are guilt and shame. And the third thing that we found in journalists is anger. That's a very strong feeling of moral injury as well. The military have been ahead of your profession for a long time on this. I mean, obviously moral injury goes back in history a long way, but there certainly was moral injury in Vietnam, the soldiers coming back, and more recently with the war in Iraq, with these youngsters coming back. They thought they'd been going to build democracy in the Middle East, and things turned out to be very different, in fact. And so they would come back with a sense of moral injury, and the military realized that this could be a very uncomfortable emotional condition, that it was troubling large numbers of soldiers. And the risk of moral injury, which by the way is not a mental illness, is not classified as a mental illness, but it can become the conduit to mental illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or substance abuse. And also from a journalist perspective, it can also change how you view your profession. So, if you've got moral injury, you become cynical about what you're doing. You feel that nothing that you do is going to make any difference, etc. You become distant from your work. You lose your passion for your work. You start distancing yourself from other people, so there can be interpersonal consequences. And there are many, many ramifications of moral injury. So it's very important that you understand what it is. The symptoms, of course, are very different from PTSD. PTSD is a mental illness, and it's defined by re-experiencing the trauma, flashbacks, unwanted recollections, nightmares, etc. There's avoidant type behavior, emotional numbing. The third symptom complex is the autonomic nervous system becomes over-aroused, so you're irritable, you can't concentrate, can't fall asleep, you've got a startle response, you're hypervigilant. The fourth symptom group is that your thoughts become negative, you can't enjoy things, you anticipate future misfortune. So that's a very quick description of what PTSD, very different from moral injury, and yet they can arise from the same kinds of trauma. And we know that they can coexist, and moral injury can become the conduit to PTSD. And like anything in medicine, the more symptoms you have, the more conditions that you have, the harder it becomes to treat. So PTSD by itself can be tough to treat, but if there's PTSD and moral injury, it's even harder to treat. And if there's PTSD and moral injury and comorbid depression, that's another level of complexity. And so you really have to try and tease these apart. You have to know what you're dealing with when you want to help someone.
Yeah. And in your experience of talking with journalists that you've treated, or just that you've encountered in your research, is this idea of moral injury really resonating, particularly in journalism? Because it's a way of of describing shame and guilt, as you've said, Dean, without necessarily prompting the response that people often give when somebody says, I feel guilty, which is to say, don't feel guilty, you know, it's not your fault.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of taking that feeling more seriously. So is that resonating with people you've met?
I think it resonates very widely. You know, my insight into moral injury came from a study sponsored by the International News Safety Institute, looking at how are journalists coping with this huge wave of migration in Europe a few years back. And we set out with okay, let's look at things like PTSD and depression and substance abuse. But I thought, okay, but there's this thing called moral injury. You know, let's have a look at moral injury. And in fact, there was no way of assessing moral injury with a rating scale for journalists. There wasn't anything like that. It didn't exist. And the military had a couple. So we borrowed from the military, but you can't equate the military with journalism because they're two fundamentally different professions. So we had to cut out a whole lot of these questions which were directly related to the military. But we could still keep some kind of generic moral injury questions in the study. And what we showed, and this was a very large study with many, you know, European and a couple of American news organizations, what we showed was that, you know, PTSD wasn't a problem in this group, nor depression, but moral injury was. This resonated widely with this group. You know, they were recovering this humanity in crisis. They saw things that deeply troubled them. They saw things that journalists were doing, that the news organizations were doing, that countries were doing, that fellow citizens were doing, that they felt had crossed some kind of moral boundary. And they felt very bad about this. And, you know, guilt, anger, shame, disgust, these were the kinds of emotions that emerged from this study. And I think that really put moral injury on the map as far as journalism was concerned, but many years behind the military.
And you've now made this scale that's been validated. So it's a 9-question test for moral injury. Is that right? And what kind of questions are asked on it?
So it was something specific for journalists. As I said, you know, we were borrowing from the military. We couldn't use that. It was just two different professions. So we did the study and, you know, interviewed a number of journalists, multiple phases to the study, face-to-face interviews and collecting all the rating scales, etc. And basically we boiled it down to a very simple scale to use in which you can divide up these 9 questions into certain categories. Some relate to your behavior, acts of commission. What did I do that I feel, you know, in retrospect, crossed a moral boundary? What do other people do, and other people being my editors, my news organizations, or the people that I report on? What is it about their behavior that I feel, you know, morally hurt by? And then the third category related to, well, what's going on in terms of social media, the internet, online harassment, which has become a huge issue for journalists. And there is, you know, morally atrocious behavior. Things are being done and said about journalists that are transgressing many thresholds. And so the scale in 9 questions covers these topics. And obviously, the higher your score on it, the more likely you are to suffer from moral injury. And we showed that, you know, this scale does correlate with symptoms of PTSD, does correlate with depression, even though it's a different construct. And it's now something that's specific for journalists. Journalists can use it. They don't have to borrow from the military anymore. Right. I think the challenge is going to be to encourage news organizations to use it, because some of the questions puts those organizations on the spot and says, you know, we might have done things in the past that journalists view as wrong. And that's an uncomfortable thing, you know, to hold the magnifying glass up and look at yourself is an uncomfortable process. But you can learn from that. You can benefit from that. And of course, it makes a news organization stronger and it will help journalists.
Yeah. And Dean, when you've talked to fellow journalists at Reuters or elsewhere about moral injury, because you must have had the sense back when you learned about it that, I don't know, maybe this is something that was unique to you or you didn't think was widespread, but what's been your experience of talking about this term?
Yeah, look, I've spoken to hundreds of journalists around the world about trauma, whether that was in my role at Reuters or since then. And I actually think, and this is just my own belief, is that moral injury probably affects more journalists than PTSD does. My sense is that trauma has affected many journalists in ways that fall outside the standard definition of say, PTSD in it. So it can be the horror of what journalists have witnessed, the injustice that journalists have seen, what journalists didn't do in the field, where they felt that they could have stepped in and helped in crisis situations and didn't. The failure of journalists' work to have any impact. You talk to any journalist who's worked in the Middle East, for example, and there's deep disillusionment about that. Journalists just feeling like they're parasites at times, being there paid to chronicle events when people are at their most vulnerable, getting first-class treatment for their own illnesses, like myself. And then for me, another big one is being treated like damaged goods by their news organizations when they get sick, being made redundant, being told they don't have a job. That really, I've had a lot of journalists say to me, and it's not just journalists, the same in veterans, the same in first responder organizations, that is really a very distressing thing to happen to journalists. So I think there's a lot of scenarios there where moral injury can occur.
Mm. Yeah, and that instance where you talk about people being laid off, that's just, I can see how that compounds somebody's misery because they're being misunderstood for the trauma that they're going through the work that they've done.
Yeah, that's right. And this is another form of moral injury, right? So we've been talking about the moral injury where someone has done something, failed to do something, or witnessed horror. There is another form of moral injury, and that's betrayal. And it's where someone has been betrayed by an organization or a justice system in a high stakes situation. And so for journalists to get, say, sick, become ill, have a mental illness, and then get laid off or fired or not used anymore, that for journalists is a deep betrayal. And it's one where the consequences can be really quite serious for people.
Yeah. And I want to talk about how we talk about healing from moral injury. And I'm actually going to bring in a special guest to join me here. And while she's coming, Dean, would you talk about how you feel? Do you feel that you've healed that moral injury, or is that an ongoing process?
No, actually, and this is the most remarkable thing for me, was that when it came to the deaths of my staff in Baghdad, how I healed from that was by going through a ceremony. I organized a memorial service for the deaths of my staff on the 10th anniversary of their deaths at a chapel near the psych ward where I was staying. And I did this in conjunction with a spiritual care worker, someone who worked as a spiritual care worker at the psych ward. And we spent a lot of time planning this ceremony. I wrote a 5,000-word letter to my dead staff, in which I sort of opened my heart and expressed all the ways I felt that I'd failed them, the things that I had not done, which if I had done, they might still be alive. And during the ceremony in this chapel, I read the letter aloud. There was the spiritual care worker went through ways of helping me forgive myself. We had candles on the altar that we'd lit, and she poured cold water over my hands. And I'm not a religious person, but this ceremony enabled me to release all the guilt and shame that I'd had. And I literally walked out of that chapel with that burden lifted, that decade-old burden had lifted off my shoulders. And it's been gone ever since. I mean, the deaths of my staff are still something that I think about, and I talk about them a lot, but they are now just part of my narrative. They're just part of my story. They're a properly filed memory, if you like, whereas before it was them and how I had failed them that brought me to the brink of suicide a year before.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That sounds so powerful. I'm going to introduce, this is Kuma Chow. So Kuma is a former journalist who also has a master's degree in mental health counselling. So she's right in the right field as well. And she's now a PhD student in philosophy, and you're focusing your research on applying philosophical counselling to journalists suffering moral injury. So can you talk about whether this idea is resonating with the journalists that you're speaking to, and how can counseling help?
Yeah, sure. So I'm still in my early stage of the research. and I have talked to a few journalists. So here I want to share some of the more injuries that they've told me about, which, yeah, similar to what Dean has shared as well. So a journalist told me that the Hong Kong protests and the situation, the tense relationship between Taiwan and China, causing her a lot of stress, given all the freedom that she sees as being missing. And also, and another journalist was saying that she went to a war zone covering the Ukraine war with someone, another journalist, going in with a different mindset, trying to make a name for himself instead of trying going in to report the injustice. So different values. So I mean, the first example is the concept of the state control of the people versus people, the journalists, deeply held value of individual freedom and safety. And also the second case is just what is wrong and what is right. Is it going in to try to report the injustice, or is it just making a name or a fame for yourself? And then I have journalists telling me that she was reporting some rape cases, but then there is a lot of online harassment. So a lot of men commenting or actually doing second-degree damage to the victim as well. And there are younger journalists telling me, well, the editors in the newsroom are sensationalizing the story and misrepresenting the story. But due to her being inexperienced, she feels like lacking that seniority in the newsroom is not giving her any right to speak up. So having talked to the journalist, I identified that there are some kind of cognitive traps, as Anthony talked about, such as, they feel it is their moral obligation to be angry and upset. Otherwise, it makes them less human. They have to be angry. That's what they think. And also they feel like that example, you can only speak up if you're seniors. So, and also there is this trap thinking, well, then given the protest and the, the international relations being like this is, I cannot change anything. This is a disaster, it's the end of the world. So catastrophizing things. So what I have found to be quite useful is by talking to the journalist about the concept of moral decision-making and different moral systems. So when we understand that there are many constraints in moral decision-making, such as lack of information, lack of time, we're given very little time as a journalist, and it's always a deadline, or we're put into situations where there's very little time to react. And when we consider all the constraints that we face when we make that decision, it's easier to have that self-compassion that we don't make all the perfect choices and not to be morally perfect all the time. And also the concept of people having different moral systems, and say, I will explore with them different philosophies to see which one resonates with them the best. So some journalists respond very well when you talk about stoicism. So being stoic is when you worry less. Actually, don't worry about what's outside of your control. Just worry what you can control, what is within your control, and focus on that. Other journalists respond very well, such as they share the concern, as Dean told us about as well, is about protecting the team. When they go into a war zone, they feel like it's their obligation to make sure everybody is safe. But when I talk to them about this concept of agency, everybody is their own person. They can make their own decision. They come in with skills. They bring in the strengths to the team as well. When they feel like they can share this with the team, share the responsibility, and also to have a conversation before going into the field as well. So then they can talk about, such as in the case like of the journalist going to Ukraine, thinking that, well, she teamed up with someone she shouldn't have, right? Someone with a different objective. Then by having conversations beforehand, it can also prevent more injuries by aligning your values with others, or by cultivating the understanding of who you're working with. One more thing that I have explored with journalists is the concept of I Ching. since I am doing the PhD in philosophy and I am applying philosophical counseling to journalists, so I do explore different concepts of philosophies. I Ching goes back to like thousands of years in China being the oldest literature. The concept of everything in the world changes, and the only thing that doesn't change is that everything changes. And what do you do when your internal deeply held values do not align with what is there outside, say in the state or say in the work environment? And the concept of I Ching is that you can cultivate and nurture your integrity. And when the environment isn't ideal for you to act, then you wait for the time when it is, ideal and optimal. So it's, in a sense, you do not have to give up, but you think about how you nurture and plan the time. And yeah.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's such really interesting ideas that you're talking through with them. And I wanted to introduce Kuma partly because you're looking for research subjects and actually offering free counseling to journalists all around the world to participate in your research. So if anybody on the call is interested in that, you can send an email to this is the same as the question@fcchk.org to be in touch with Kuma for talking about free therapy. And thank you so much for that. It's really interesting. And actually, yeah, I want to pick up, with our guests about just talking about some of these workplace issues, about things like hierarchy in journalism institutions preventing mental health from being something that gets discussed. Dean, can I go back to you to talk a little bit about when you became head of mental wellbeing? That's the title at Reuters. How did you start? You were the first person to hold that job title, I think. How did you start thinking about implementing mental health policy at Reuters?
Well, look, I was very excited about this role being created. I suggested it. Reuters, I thought, bought into it. I was wrong, but the idea was to try and change a culture. The idea was to try and make mental health a real priority. At Reuters, among its 2,500 journalists around the world, 1,500 stringers, to really make mental health a pillar of every newsroom. And what I discovered, sadly, was that while there was sort of interest in this, when I started trying to implement the sort of measures that I felt were needed based on my own experience, based on evidence-based research, based on the sort of work that Anthony had been doing, I just ran into resistance everywhere. Management, HR, legal, even senior colleagues. And as a result, I wasn't able to create a single word of policy from HR to guide and support the mental health of Reuters journalists. There was just so many things I came up with were blocked. And I think in the end, it was just, there was a feeling amongst management that this is just too difficult, that we've got too many other things to do, and we just don't want this guy buzzing around our heads with all this stuff. And so what really did it for me, and one of the reasons why I left, was I was eventually told that if I wanted to stay at Reuters, all my work would be channeled through a sort of a so-called journalist council, which didn't even exist, basically to stop me from contacting the Reuters leadership directly. And by then I was deeply stressed about the resistance I was facing, because the Reuters journalists were under enormous stress. I was just getting constantly people reaching out to me all the time about the stress and the trauma they were experiencing and the problems they were having with management. And it sort of became a point where I almost had to admit myself to the psych ward again because of the stress that I was encountering with this job. And so I left. I just couldn't take it anymore. And really, it was a shame, because Reuters had a chance, I think, to do something really special in journalism, in global journalism, to really institutionalize change and to lead the way. And the Reuters leadership failed. And I think it was a great tragedy.
What kind of things did you feel were working well? I mean, yeah, you say it was the leadership that was blocking things, but what about with the journalists, with the work?
Yeah, no, and look, and here's the thing, that the things that worked, actually, one of the things that really worked, and it surprised me how well this worked, was I started writing a few blogs when I first took on this role, just about my own PTSD. And then before I knew it, I had other senior correspondents coming to me and saying, I want to write about my bipolar disorder, or I want to write about my depression, or I want to write about my burnout. And in the 3 years I did that role, we ended up running internally about 30 blogs, and they were such a sledgehammer against stigma and shame. And what they did was they sort of helped create an environment where Reuters journalists could actually put their hand up and get help and know that they weren't the only ones doing that. And it didn't cost the company a cent. And I think that was something that showed the power of journalists and the power of storytelling to actually take charge of this particular element, this very important element of normalizing the conversation. You know, people were talking about the therapy they were in, the therapy they were getting, really honest conversations and disclosures, if you like. And that made me very proud to see how that took off. And I think when I look back, that was really one of the real positive things that came out of the role. And it's something that can be done anywhere. You just need a couple of people to say, hey, we might start some staff blogs, and we're going to start this conversation going. Because once it starts, and once you get a few people sharing their stories, it can become a very powerful way to normalize these conversations.
And those blogs are still all up online. You can actually take them.
They're all up online. Yeah, they're still there on this website that I finally managed to get up. But it's something that some news organizations that I'm doing some work with have started as well. They love the concept. And you'll see it. I think, the research, I think, is pretty clear that where in organizations where staff are sharing their stories, it can be a very powerful way to normalize these important conversations.
Yeah, and I do recommend anyone checks that website out, because they are amazing to read, I think, purely because you realize it's so rare that you do see people sharing such honest personal stories like that. But Anthony, I mean, do you think that we are getting closer to news organizations implementing good mental health strategy? And what do you know about, what that could look like for a news organization to have a really good mental health strategy in place?
I mean, I do think things have changed because, I've been doing this for 23 years now. And so when I started out, there was nothing in place. There wasn't even a discussion about it. And now news organizations do talk about it. There are news organizations who provide counseling where in the past they didn't. There's a lot more educational sessions that are given to news organizations. And so, I mean, it depends on how you measure success. But I think in terms of a sea shift, absolutely, particularly in Western news organizations. But outside of those organizations, like to study Kenya, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, there's no discussion of this at all. Even in Mexico, which has a very well-developed healthcare system and a very solid psychiatric system as well, there wasn't a discussion about this. There was the data out there. There was a disconnect between the data and what are you going to do about the data? And that's a real pity because, all the data that we collect is given back to news organizations to use. I believe in data. I believe data, if you collect data well, it tells a very powerful story. If your research is robust and you've got a good methodology, then it conveys a very important message. Back in 2000 and 2001, when we did the study, the data were very strong. And it led to an interest and a shift in some big news organizations. Things stalled, things go in fits and starts. But the situation now, notwithstanding all the challenges that Dean has faced, it's a different landscape now to what it was 20 years back. We'd all like it to move quicker, but there's definitely been progress, depending on where you go, of course.
And how would a news organization start? Do you think that for change to happen, it has to come from the top, or can it be led by peers, talking to each other?
I think when it comes from the top, it's a very powerful message. I think it certainly helps, but then it has to filter down. I mean, the rank and file have to embrace this as well. I think everything starts with education. You just have to educate people. What is trauma? How does it develop? What are the symptoms, etc.? How can you treat it? I mean, if you're not educated about it, you can't change. Change comes about through education. So I say time and time again, it's education, education, education. And you have to educate people from, the journalists in the field all the way up to the top of management. So everybody basically understands what you're dealing with over here. At the end of the day, mental health therapy is cheap therapy. It's not high-tech medicine. You're not ordering very expensive investigations or complex brain MRI, things like this. It's understanding and talking about things. At the end of the day, the savings are going to be enormous, because when people go off sick, it's often because of mental health reasons. Conditions like PTSD and depression bring someone down very hard indeed, lots and lots of missed work hours, etc. And so it's in everybody's interests that you understand what's going on and you provide good treatment. Everybody will benefit from that. But change comes about slowly. And in my field of mental illness, it seems even slower than other fields for all sorts of complex psychosocial reasons. But I do believe the needle has shifted. When I see how many students are doing PhDs on the topic now, how many people write to me or write to Dean asking questions. Back in 2000, this wasn't happening at all. It was a desert. It was a wilderness. There was just no one was talking about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So things have moved, but I think we'd like them to move faster.
Right. Yeah. There's reason for hope. I just want to remind people, if you want to send in a question, I have a couple of questions here. You can email question@fcchk.org and I'll read your question out. Yeah, I have a couple of questions here. So one comes from one of our listeners, and he says, if a journalist is about to enter a conflict zone, how can they better prepare themselves? And what can a news organization do to help the journalists once they return? And throw that to either of you, really.
Well, I think it's a great question, because now once again, it comes back starting with education. So for example, the New York Times has a system in place in which every foreign correspondent has to get an education session from me before they go into a particular conflict. And basically, what do we talk about? I'm not their therapist, but we're there to talk about what is good mental health. Let me educate you about trauma. Let's speak about what can be done. What are the warning signs? And that kind of discussion starts even before they go into the war zone. So it's very important. You're proactive. You're not waiting for a problem, but you're kind of educating people beforehand. I mean, what Dean said just now was very telling. He said, he had no notion of what mental health trauma was when he went into this very senior position on running the Reuters bureau in Iraq at the height of a war. There wasn't even a discussion about it. And so because you're not aware of what it is, if you're ignorant of what it is, you miss it. And I found exactly the same thing when I started my research in 2000. I would speak to journalists, very smart, very articulate, accomplished, creative people who were incredibly psychologically naive. What is this thing called trauma? Had no notion of what it was. They were suffering and they knew they weren't feeling right, but what is this thing called trauma? And so when you educate people in advance, that's a very important first step.
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be other steps as well, but you want to start with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And there's another question here, which I feel is quite a poignant question. I think maybe Dean, you'll relate to this. When your whole passion and life revolves around doing journalism, but it comes with so much psychological pressure, is giving journalism a pause or quitting a way out? Which just sort of exactly speaks to this whole question of moral injury.
Yeah, look, it's tough. I mean, I got to a point in early 2016 when I was diagnosed with PTSD. I thought my journalism career was over, and for me, it was a great loss. I mean, journalism was my identity. That was who I was. I'd been a journalist for 26 years, and to think that that's gone was very distressing. But what I've found is that I could never go back and do news again because of my nervous system is just wired differently now. I could not handle the stress of news. It would be too much for me. But what I have found is that I've written this book. I do podcasts. I host a podcast series. I do a lot of blogging, if you like, on social media. So it took me years to understand this, that I actually was still a journalist, but just in a different way. And so I think my message for people out there who feel that at some stage their careers might be over, there are new careers out there that you will use those skills as a journalist, and you might still be a journalist, but just in a different medium or in a different way, a different format. And for me, when I realized that I was still a journalist, it was like I reclaimed a bit of my old identity, and that became part of my new identity. And it was a wonderful feeling, because I don't think we ever want to lose what we've done as journalists. And I discovered this in the psych ward with all the veterans and the coppers and AMBO paramedics. We'd all go and do what we did again in a heartbeat. I'd jump on a plane in a heartbeat because we loved what we did. So that's very special to us, and I think it's important to understand that.
Thanks for that.
But you see that, but there, if I could just chip in, there's another cognitive trap. You never want to make a major life-altering decision when you're in the throes of strong emotion like that, because your decision-making process becomes distorted by your emotions. And so you could give up a career for all the wrong reasons because your judgment is off. Your decision-making process is faulty because of your trauma, because of your emotional distress. And so that becomes an added complication because you could paint yourself into a very difficult corner unwittingly, making all these wrong choices because they're being driven by your emotional distress. The much healthier approach is to not make those major decisions at times like this, but get well, get your psychological health back, and then reappraise your situation. And that's another one.
Anthony's absolutely right, Olivia. I mean, people say, journalists ask me, can you keep doing this? Can you keep reporting in war zones, or can you keep covering conflict, or can you keep working with distressing imagery? And I say, absolutely. There's absolutely no reason why you can't, but you have to be aware of the psychological risks, and you have to get help if you need it. If you want a long career in this, you can't stick your head in the sand.
Yeah, thank you for great answers. Yeah. One more question this is for Dean. You spoke a little about the treatment of journalists who suffer moral injury or PTSD. Is there a tendency for media companies to rely too heavily on internal peer support networks rather than investing in professional therapies?
Look, I'm not sure. Certainly at Reuters had a fantastic peer network. That was one excellent initiative at Reuters, and I think the peer network, which still exists, is a great way of allowing journalists to talk to colleagues who understand what they're going through, who can be a sounding board, if you like. And then the way the peers are trained at Reuters is those peers will then be a pathway to professional help if they feel that the journalist they are speaking to might require it. And Reuters has a very good external trauma support service. I don't know I'm not really, I don't think many journalists actually have formal peer organizations outside of Reuters and the BBC, but I think they're great services. But organizations must have they must have external trauma support services available. Every media organization must have one to have that 24/7 service available. It should be available to family members as well. And it should be with an organization that understands the journalism culture and the sort of stresses and strains that journalists experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you. We've just got 2 minutes left, and I want to use them to ask you both to just give your advice, or just tell us what helps keep you both well. What's your advice on well-being and self-care?
Well, number one, I love my work. Number two, I have life outside of work. So it's very important that when I come home in the evening, I have things other than my work, be it family, be it friends. I play my violin, I love my music. So those kind of things nourish me. I think it's the all-round trying to maintain this elusive life work balance, which can be so difficult at times. But I think it's very important you do that, because otherwise you do run the risk of burnout and mental distress.
Yeah, what I learned, Olivia, on my third psych ward admission was that if I wanted to make my family my priority in my life, which I did, then I had to look after myself. And if I looked after myself, then my family would get the best of me. And I'd also do some pretty good work. It was a very simple lesson that I learned, and it's one that I try and stick to all the time now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you both so much. And I do want to remind everyone to look out for both of the books that you've written, both coming up. And one more resource I think that's great is Dean, is your podcast, Mind Armor, which I've been listening to a lot, which is just great stories of people who've gone through really difficult things and talking about resilience. One more great resource I think for journalists on trauma is at the Dart Centre. Their website has really, really good resources. And you can also check out mentalhealthreuters.com, which is the website that you helped set up, which is really fantastic. There's great information there about mental illness and how it relates to journalism. And of course, if you'd like to be in touch with Kuma to know more about her research or to participate, drop a line to that same question email. But we'll wrap up there. So thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time talking about this topic and hope we keep moving forward on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Pleasure.
Good night, everyone.